listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio, man. We are here once again. And today, man, we have an amazing show. We have amazing guests. The one and only Leonydus, man, he's here going to be talking about a very, very important subject. And, you know, it's going to raise some eyebrows. And that's good. It's raising the book that we're going to be talking about today is amazing book that he wrote is Raising Victims. And, man, first and foremost, I just want to jump the gun. You tell us what this is all about, because it's a hot topic, man. I said that in the beginning, but I want to just let you have the floor. What inspired you to write this, and why is it so important for us to check out?
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate you having me on, man. So I thank you for that and giving me the time here. So thank you. But yeah, the book is called Raising Victims, and the subtitle is The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. And, what I really wanted to do with the book is really expose what critical race theory is from the founders' own mouth, from their own lips and their own words, and how it's really infiltrating our society in the form of diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and how nefarious it is and how it's negatively impacting us as a country. And, a lot of times, people want a normal everyday person that is compassionate would want to push back against racism. And, one of the criticisms I get pretty frequently is like, how could you say racism doesn't exist? And that's not the thing at all. Of course, racism exists. Of course it does. And normal functioning people want to push back against racism. But what I really wanted people to understand with this book is that critical race theory is racism. It is racism at its root, and it's using racism to push this neo-Marxist cultural revolution. And basically, like I said in the book, is raising our kids to see themselves as victims or as oppressors and pit those groups against each other. So it's very toxic. And then underlying all of that is my push toward a post-racial, colorblind society, the sense of seeing each other as individuals and judging each other by the content of character, not the color of skin, and that as the antithesis and the antidote for what we're seeing in our society and how we need to move forward as a country.
And for those who are listening and maybe have your listening ears, let's not prejudge anything, because someone listens right now might say, well, okay, Leonydus, I see what he's saying, but they want to teach, Black history or whatever.
Sure.
Why are you trying to shut that down? Like, can't we learn about, our Black history? What do you say to that person?
Yeah, one thing that critical race theory does, it uses what I call a Mott and Bailey tactic. What's called a Mott and Bailey tactic, which basically means that it hides the more nefarious radical ideology under things that most people would agree with. And the idea of teaching Black history is one of those. So it'll push the more, well, I should tell you what critical race theory is, and then we'll go from there. Critical race theory is the idea that racism is endemic in our society, and it's interwoven into the fabric of our institutions to the point of invisibility. So it's this idea that all racial disparities are due to racial bias or racial oppression, even when no racism is directly apparent. And this is a Marxist concept and it comes from the cultural hegemony is the term that was coined by Antonio Gramsci. And it basically means that the system was built to benefit those in power, and it's created this sort of matrix where people are oppressed and they don't even realize that they're oppressed because it's just the normal everyday operation of things. It's just the status quo of the culture. And that's what critical race theory promotes. And that's what they're teaching in schools, and that's what they're basically instilling in children. And then when you say like, well, I don't want children to learn that racism is in everything and that all white people are racist and that all Black people are oppressed. I don't want my children to learn that. And then people will say, well, you just don't want your kids to learn Black history. And it's just not, it's not that. It's a very manipulative way of getting people to capitulate to the narrative. And yeah, I mean, and I know these things are emotional topics and people have their their presuppositions about things. And, the minute you push back on some of it, if they have a certain stance or something like that, then a lot of times people will immediately turn off and say, oh, you're anti-Black, or you support the white supremacy, or you hate Black people, or you don't want to fight against racism. And that's not what this is about. That's not what the book is about. The book is about looking at how race is being used as a weapon in order to manipulate people and get them to buy into these radical ideologies. I don't think that most Black people are Marxist. I don't think that. But what's happening is that race is being used to manipulate Black people into embracing Marxism and Marxist concepts. And I don't think a lot of people even recognize that. It's a lot of surface level analysis. Because again, somebody hears a phrase like Black Lives Matter, and of course, most people are going to agree with that. Most people are going to go along with that. But you look underneath of it and you say, like, well, okay, they're talking about dismantling the nuclear family and pitting groups of oppressors and victims against each other as collective identities rather than individuals, and like all of these other things that underlie the ideology. And people say, whoa, that's not what I signed up for. Like, I just thought we were just talking about Black Lives Matter and talking about individual situations of fighting against injustice. I didn't realize we were talking about all of this Marxist ideology and tearing down the entirety of our Constitution and pushing back against free speech, because those are things that CRT promotes. And I don't think a lot of people I think a lot of people just don't recognize that.
Once again, listen on Refocused Radio, talking to our guest today, Leonydus Johnson, and his book, Raising Victims, The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. Now, for our audience, if you don't mind me asking, are you Black?
Yes, I am.
The reason why I said that or asked that is because when I saw this email, because I get emails for potential guests that I can interview. I ain't gonna lie, when I first saw this email, I said, wait, is this... I'm just filling the blank. Everyone listening to this on radio can understand where I'm coming from. Is this guy trying to promote a book? Because I ain't gonna lie, that I was like, wait, because that's the first thing I saw when I read the email. I said, wait, is this guy trying to promote this? And then I did my research. I'm like, oh, it's a brother. What? And I think what you're saying is interesting. I think people have an open mind to what you're trying to say versus what they want to feel. I think that's a major difference, because yes, we do see injustices happen in the country. This is a slightly different situation, though, that is being discussed. And for those who are attached to the idea of critical race theory, and they're thinking that it's just, we can't teach, what has been history for, Black people. How important is for people to separate the two as far as what is really important with Black history versus what this whole critical race theory is all about?
Right. You have to be very aware of what's happening in the classrooms and what the motives are behind them. And I think that just comes from being involved and understanding what's happening, because you have a lot of activist teachers. It was one thing I would say too about critical race theory is that what the founders say is that it's different from most academic disciplines because it has an activist element. And they say specifically that they feel like the civil rights movement did not accomplish what it set out to accomplish. It stalled out and it didn't achieve its goals. And racism was driven underground and infused into the systems and institutions of our society. So it's interwoven into the very fabric of our country, of our society. And therefore they believe that the entirety of our institutions need to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. So, and that includes education. So you have these teachers who are learning these edicts in university, and they're going out to K through 12 classrooms, and they're infusing this in the classrooms, and this idea that the entirety of the system is racist and built on systemic racism. And the reason that your child can't do math or is struggling in English class or whatever it may be is because of systemic racism. And they're teaching that to kids. They're instilling that ideology into kids rather than teaching kids that they're resilient and that they're strong and that they have the ability to overcome obstacles and overcome adversity, and that they can do anything they put their minds to, if then they can work hard and overcome the obstacles, whatever. They're being taught that they're victims and that they're being instilled with an external locus of control, is the way I put it, that the system is operating against them, that these external forces are controlling their outcomes, and that no matter how hard they try, they can't succeed. So you have a kid in a school, it doesn't become about Black history. Like if you have a school that's, saying that, well, we just need to eliminate advanced classes because not enough Black and brown children are getting into these advanced classes, or we need to manipulate these classes in a certain way, manipulate math class. We'll talk about that. Manipulate math class in a certain way because Black students aren't excelling in math. It's a bigotry of low expectations. And to me, as a Black father, that is insulting, and it should be insulting to Black people because the notion of it is that their kids cannot succeed unless white people come to their rescue and save them and manipulate the system in some manner to allow them to succeed. And I'll give you a good example. Ketanji Brown Jackson was appointed to the Supreme Court, which is fine. It's fine that she was appointed, but the problem was that Joe Biden said that he was going to appoint a Black woman to that position. Now, most people, well, I don't say most people, a lot of people celebrated that because it is a Black woman on the Supreme Court, and there's nothing wrong with that aspect. But by him putting a filter on the position and saying that he was specifically going to nominate a Black woman, what he was saying was that she was not the best person for the job. Now, she may have been the best person for the job, but by him putting a racial and gender filter on that, he was saying that there were better options for that position. And the only way that she would get appointed is if he put that filter on that position so that she would have a chance. Another good example of that would be like if LeBron James, who was widely regarded as one of the best basketball players in the history of basketball, if we decided to lower the rim to 6 feet, clear out the defense, put LeBron on the ref's shoulders and let him dunk wide open with no opposition, that he's the best player on the court. And it would be ridiculous to give him those sort of options to completely make it so that, this is equity. We're going to fight for equity and allow him to do this for fairness. It wouldn't be necessary because he's the best player on the court. He doesn't need that help. He doesn't need it. So it would be insulting for him. So it's insulting for our children, for these people to come in and say like, well, they can't succeed in these classes unless we manipulate the classes and lower the rim to 6 feet. And it should be insulting, but that's exactly what CRT does.
Man, that's an interesting point. I know some people may be like, but Leonydus, this, and that. And we can go back and forth on what we believe is true or what we believe is not true or what we think was correct, what we think isn't correct.
Sure.
But I like the title of your book, Raising Victims, because it made me think. All right, at first when I read it, I was like, man, I'm offended. What was this guy going to be talking about on the show? But then it's like when you read more and you listen to what you're saying right now, it's like, okay, hold up. Okay, raising victims. That is, I'm going to be in trouble with saying this, but I don't care. This always going to be cool, but some others may not appreciate this. I think that's true, man. It's a risk playing the victim. And I'm not saying this to anything that ever happened to any Black person. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying to the point of what we're talking about, critical race theory. I think that's a solid point.
I appreciate that, man. I appreciate it. I would say that there is a difference between being victimized by something and harboring a victim mentality. which, one is something that it's just a fact of life. It's something that happens to everybody. Bad things happen. It's a thing. The other is a choice. The other is destructive choice. And one of the stories I like to use for this is the story of Finding Nemo. And I'm assuming most people are familiar with that film. I can't believe it was 20 years ago when that came out. I can't believe that.
I don't think there was any clapping in that film.
That's nuts. But in Finding Nemo, you have this young fish with a gimpy fin who's kidnapped from his overprotective father and taken across the ocean and then thrown into a fish tank somewhere in Australia. And so he's thrown into this strain, and he's taken from his family. He has a gimpy fin. He's thrown into this strange environment, this new strange environment. You could easily say he was being oppressed at that point, right? Like he's a true victim. And then he's faced with the prospect of being given to this 8-year-old terror who's known to kill fish, and he freaks out, right? And he gets stuck in that filter tube in the fish tank. And all the fish are freaking out, and because he's clearly a victim at this point. But then Gil comes out, the leader of the fish tank, and he's like, "Nobody touch him, nobody touch him." And Gil surveys the situation, and he's like, "You got yourself in there, you swim yourself out," which on the surface seems cruel, right? It seems cruel for him to do that, from given all the things that Nemo has been through, and the fact that he doesn't have a good fin, which Nemo said, "I don't have my fin's gimpy, my fin's messed up." It seems cruel to do that. But what Gil was doing was he was instilling in Nemo an internal locus of control. He was telling Nemo that, listen, you may not be able to control everything that happens to you. Life isn't fair. Things are going to happen that are out of your control, that are not fair. And you're going to find yourself facing adversity and facing obstacles. But you have the choice how to respond to that. You may not be able to control everything that happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. And you have strength, you have resiliency, you have the ability and the fortitude to overcome that adversity. And because he did that, Nemo was able to overcome it and swim out on his own. And later he was able to actually save his friend Dory and save a bunch of other fish from a fishing net, because he had that internal fortitude, that internal strength, that idea that he had the power to control his own destiny. So those are the things that we should be teaching children. Those are the values we should be instilling in our kids, even in the face of true adversity, even in the face of things that are out of their control. We should be teaching them that they have the power to overcome those things and, push back, not teaching them that they're helpless and victims and that, it's the system's going to control your outcomes. That is disempowering and it's destructive. And it's not what we should be teaching our children, especially in cases when it's not even true. And that's where it gets into trouble, because a lot of times people, they really hone in and assume that racism is in places where it's not apparent, and they want to blame racism for all of these ills that are happening. But even though there's no evidence of it, but ultimately it doesn't even matter, because it's like, man, like, you have the power to overcome. Why are you letting other people control your outcomes? Why are you letting other people decide who you are and shape your identity? Like, that should be internal. That should be you. And that's the things that we should be teaching our children.
Once again, talking to our guest, Leonydus Johnson, and about his book, Raising Victims: The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. I know a lot of people gonna be like, okay, deep breath. Okay. What is he saying? Well, I'm going to try my best to help them out. It's important to, like you're saying, understand what you can control and what you cannot control. If anything, that should be a pinpoint to this interview. When you start to understand what you can truly control versus what you absolutely cannot control. You should ask yourself, what is this goal of critical race theory? Because it doesn't sound like a typical class that, I took some African-American studies when I was in college. This don't sound like that. It sounds a little bit deeper, a little bit more like, this happened to you and you should feel bad and blah, 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 blah. It sounds like a negative bent towards it versus actually learning something. I mean, it should be more of a, like what you said earlier in the show, what can you control versus what you cannot. You can control how you react to something. You can't control what happens around you. And if we ignore that point, then yes, I can see why someone could be emotionally attached to this. You know, we must have critical race theory. I get that. And I'm going to sound like, you know, I'm stepping on some toes, but I don't know. I think it's important to pinpoint that conversation of you have to learn what you can control versus what you cannot, because raising victims, to me, after hearing what you're saying, it sounds like just that. You're raising a victim. And again, I'm stressing this enough. I'm not saying anything to any recent events or anything like that, but simply what Leonydus is talking about with this critical race theory. Do your research, read it on yourself, and then decide for yourself if this is really what it is being presented as, or if there's a deeper situation there.
I like it. One more thing I would say, I would add to it is, you know, the idea of existence of racism and pushing back against racial injustice. I'm an individualist and I push back against collectivism as an identity. And I think that one of the things I mentioned earlier is that I think if we move toward a more individualist, post-racial, colorblind sort of society where we treat people as individuals rather than collective groups, then we can view situations on a case-by-case basis rather than making it indicative of this larger conspiracy and trying to hold people accountable for things they didn't do, this idea of collective guilt, and then trying to provide retribution or recompense to people for things they never experienced, which would be a sense of collective victimhood. What we need is...
You hit something there.
Yeah. But I mean, if you focus on the individual cases, if there is injustice, then hold the person accountable who engaged in the injustice and provide recompense to the victim. I think that makes sense, but collectivizing it doesn't make sense. It's going to drive enmity, and it's disempowering, and it's just going to make things worse.
Man, you said something there. I mean, that's a whole nother show, but yeah, you talking about that little thing that's going on. I think California, they're in the talks or rumors of some kind of, you know, payout or something like that. Like
reparations, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now that I definitely think I don't get that situation. I don't get why people want to pay out. I mean, I get it, but I don't think it helps at all. I think it definitely aligns with your idea of raising victims. I mean, I know someone's going to send me an email after this, but that's okay. I think the point of this conversation is kind of do your research. Don't just go with the flow. Just because everyone is doing this or doing that, saying this or saying that, doesn't mean you have to step in line with the same idea. Because we're not talking about, you know, which race is more important than the other one. You know, we're not talking about that. We're talking about something that is probably not contributing in the right ways of teaching, if I can put it that way. Because there's one way to teach where it's a teaching for all students, and there's another way of teaching, kind of was pointing to with your book, Raising a Victim. And I think if people can take the emotion part out of the equation, maybe this will become clear. So with that, man, it's a deep conversation, having an awesome conversation with Leonydus Johnson. Get his book, Raising Victims, The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. Man, how can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, my Twitter handle is at Leonydus Johnson. Same thing on Facebook. I have a YouTube channel as well, and I have a Substack. It's leonydus.substack.com.